During his term as president, Roosevelt set aside 230 million acres in national parks, forests, monuments, and game preserves. That's 84,000 acres for every day he was president. During his second term in office, Roosevelt developed a two-part foreign affairs policy that combined his quiet diplomacy with the power of military might. He called it "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Under Roosevelt's orders, the recently fortified U.S. Navy, known as the Great White Fleet, 16 ships and 14,000 sailors, set sail on a 2-year tour of the world, flexing America's military muscle for all to see. But there was a problem. Naval vessels and cargo ships traveling from one coast to the other had to sail around the tip of South America, a journey that could take more than 6 months. Roosevelt proposed that a massive canal be dredged across the nation of Colombia. The canal would shorten the distance and time by half. But Colombia rejected Roosevelt's offer. Fed up with negotiations, he encouraged the province of Panama to revolt against Colombia. On November 13, 1903, with American gunships anchored offshore, the Panamanian army declared independence, and a new country was born. Within 5 days, it signed a canal treaty with the U.S. for $10 million. The ousted Colombians got nothing.
He simply rode roughshod over the niceties of diplomacy. He engineered a revolution in Panama, and within 2 weeks of the creation of this new government, whose existence was guaranteed by the U.S. Navy, he extorted a deal that gave the United States a 99-year lease and rights to build this Panama Canal. And for the rest of his life, he was utterly unrepentant.
As Roosevelt infamously put it, instead of debating for a half-century before building the canal, it would be better to build the canal first and debate me for a half-century. Roosevelt would leave his greatest mark on history with the Panama Canal, and it would set a precedent for American intervention in the politics of other countries when it suited the needs of the United States. At the height of his popularity, and after 7.5 years leading the nation, Theodore Roosevelt's term in office came to an end. Confident that he had left the reins of government in good hands with his friend William Howard Taft, Roosevelt and his son Kermit departed for a year-long African safari.
Americans had grown fascinated by the Roosevelt story while he was president, and they weren't going to let it go. Roosevelt didn't disappear by any means. He kept filing these reports from the hunting front, so to speak, this serialized account of his safari. So Roosevelt was always in the forefront of the American consciousness.
15 months later, Roosevelt returned to a hero's welcome in New York. But greetings and parades were not enough action for Roosevelt. He jumped at the chance to lead a new independent party called the Progressives. Soon known as the Bull Moose Party for its formidable leader, Roosevelt campaigned on a platform of groundbreaking social reform based upon his square deal policies. He advocated workers' compensation, a woman's right to vote, a national minimum wage, unemployment insurance, old age pensions, and the abolition of child labor.
We stand for a living wage, to provide for education and recreation, to care for immature members of the family, to maintain the family during periods of sickness, and to permit a reasonable saving for old age. We hold that the employment of women over 48 hours per week is abnormal and should be prohibited. We hold that the 7-day working week is abnormal. We hold that 1 day of rest in 7 should be provided by law.
The Progressive Party policies, however, were too far ahead of their time. Roosevelt lost to Democrat Woodrow Wilson. Defeated for the first time, Roosevelt returned to private life. But he didn't stay there long. European powers were preparing to fight a monumental war. On August 3, 1914, Germany declared war on France, initiating World War I. President Wilson was convinced that America needed to remain neutral in the European conflict. Roosevelt disagreed and called Wilson's inaction criminal and dubbed his foreign policy timid and spiritless.
It just galled him no end that Wilson, this person who didn't know the first thing about foreign policy, who, by most evidence, had really not given foreign affairs a serious thought before he became president, was in charge of the United States, was commander-in-chief of American forces during the greatest war in history, and he, Theodore Roosevelt, was not.
In 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. 8 days later, Colonel Roosevelt, as he liked to be called, met with President Wilson. By then, he was blind in his left eye, suffered serious hearing loss, and hobbled on gout-swollen ankles. Yet he asked Wilson for permission to lead a division of troops into battle. But Wilson had every reason to fear Roosevelt politically and turned him down, telling his aides, the best way to treat Mr. Roosevelt is to take no notice of him. Roosevelt went home. A soldier no more, he could only watch as war engulfed the world. But watching was not Roosevelt's strong suit. As America prepared for combat, Citizen Roosevelt became an outspoken supporter of the war effort, rallying the public and young recruits. Proudly for Roosevelt, his 4 sons enlisted in the armed forces.
Roosevelt could no longer go into battle. So what did he do? He sent his sons into battle. He pulled every political string he could to get his sons into the thick of battle, where their chances of getting killed were absolutely the greatest.
Kermit Roosevelt was decorated for bravery with the British Military Cross. Ted Jr. led his men in the French Battle of Cantigny. Archie showed courage in battle as well and suffered serious injuries. Youngest son Quentin was a pilot, flying sorties behind enemy lines.
And for the first time, I'm convinced, for the first time, Roosevelt understood the costs of his own earlier vision of courage. He thought the highest form of courage was to bare your breast in battle and to charge up in the galling fire of the enemy, risking your own life. What he didn't understand was that it could be equally hard, maybe even harder, to stay at home, waiting to get that telegram.
On July 17, 1918, news arrived that Quentin was missing in action, shot down behind enemy lines. 2 days later, Quentin's death was confirmed. He was 20 years old.
Heroism in battle. His son has exhibited this, and what has it gotten him? He's dead. And Roosevelt then is left to ask himself, have I deluded myself my whole life? During those last several months of Roosevelt's life, people who knew him would report that he would just sit in the window, staring out, and just saying, poor Quinnican.
On the evening of January 5, 1919, Roosevelt commented to Edith that he did not feel well and retired to bed. That night, Theodore Roosevelt died in his sleep. He was 60 years old. His son Archie sent a telegram to his brothers in France. It read simply, "The old lion is dead." Buried with Theodore Roosevelt is a monumental chapter of American history. But through that history, he lives on in the nation that he helped to build, in the ever-evolving programs of social reform that he devoted his life to.
The thing we see most today is what he did for conservation, because he changed America's attitude about the environment.
He launched the presidency in a different direction. He changed the course of American government, and we recognize now we've got a very strong presidency on our hands.
With Theodore Roosevelt, the president comes to center stage. And to a certain extent, he yanked the United States quite clearly into the 20th century. The U.S. would have got into the 20th century eventually, but it wouldn't have come with such a rush and with such a bang.
For the 60 years that he lived, Theodore Roosevelt was a man both of his time and ahead of his time. An American icon, he reached for every opportunity for himself and for the country that he loved. As he wrote, "The joy of living is his who has the heart to demand it."